Along with higher wages and interest rates, one of the challenges for business and consumers is the prospect of higher prices until global supply chains return to some sense of normal. But with China's biggest cities still locked up, that could be some way off. Steph Nash reports.
Against the odds, Australians saved a lot of money during COVID. Treasurer Josh Frydenberg calls it a savings war chest.
Australian businesses and households have accumulated more than $400 billion on their balance sheets that was not there at the start of the pandemic.
But now those savings may be the buffer that families and businesses need to afford a life that has suddenly become a lot more expensive. Our official inflation rate is 5.1% higher than it was a year ago. The problem with that is that every person and business has their own inflation rate. Depending on what you consume, your cost of living could be rising much faster. Petrol is an obvious increase, above $2 a litre in March, up 11%, and amplified by the conflict in Ukraine. But the official stats also show big increases for food and drinks, up 4.3%. The sudden spike in grocery prices has come as a rude shock, so much so that the everyday Australian is making sacrifices. According to a PwC price report commissioned by German supermarket Aldi, 44% of shoppers are cutting back on eating out and buying takeaway. 39% are reducing their purchases of meat and protein, and over a fifth are buying less food altogether.
They're coming back on takeaway, but they're also very conscious of the petrol pump. But obviously we have to move from A to B, so that's a cost. Groceries they're cutting back on. That's unfortunate because as Australian families we need to eat. And it's all right if it's indulgences like cheese you don't need and things like that. But we've actually found through the research they're cutting back on some things like fresh meat. And that's kind of concerning.
We took to the streets to test this theory. Are everyday Australians already making inflation-related cutbacks, or are they dipping into their savings to sustain their lifestyles?
We have a few of the more luxury items we've left alone, and petrol as well. So driving a bit less if possible.
We've actually had to sacrifice on some dairy products, so that...
Dairy products, did you say?
Yeah, dairy products. So just limiting our milk use and butter and stuff like that.
Yeah, in terms of travel expenses, especially with petrol, I've had to cut down on my petrol intake to afford food, I guess, yeah.
We've just been more careful with what we buy and look for more bargains.
I probably do make some cuts, but I still get what I really need, but I buy in bulk when things are on special.
Look, I think I just buy more seasonal things. I just look for specials, so definitely it's price driven.
No more fruit or veg, can't be doing that anymore.
And Aldi's analysis is seeing this change in consumer behaviour as well.
We are seeing people sort of step away from those proteins which are centre of the plate. Also around the plate, and as we talk in the industry, is our fruit and veg. And we've seen that some of the producers in that area have also suffered through shortages from labour. And seasonal workforces haven't been available, and we've seen some cost increases. And obviously with fuel, that's also gone up, so transport. So primary producers have been putting through cost increases to retailers like us. We tried to hold on those cost increases before we pass it on to the customers, but customers are going to see cost increases over the next 6 months as some of this inflation hits.
The reality is, everyday living costs are likely to keep rising. We can see the future simply by looking at the US. In April, annual inflation in the US was 8.3%. Petrol costs lifted sharply, up 44% over the past year. Energy bills are up 30%, and food prices up by almost 10%.
I think Australia is going to mirror what has been happening in the US, just with a 3 to 6 month delay. The hard thing, of course, for the RBA is that they only get the reading every 3 months and not every month like everywhere else in the world.
So what's driving the rise in food prices?
International shipping has been in disarray for the last couple of years.
Outside of labour shortages and supply constraints, freight costs for Australian companies have skyrocketed. In most cases, shipping containers cost 5 times more than they did before the pandemic.
We're still trying to get enough capacity into the international shipping market to meet the demand. And then on top of that, we've had a whole lot of other issues as well.
On top of higher freight rates to cope with the demand and soaring fuel costs, there are other shipping container-related penalties, adding billions of dollars of extra costs down the length of our supply chains. Container detention charges, for example, are penalties imposed by international shipping lines for any containers not returned within the allocated time frame, usually around 7 days. It's the perfect storm. With delays in goods coming out of a lockdown China, unprecedented levels of demand, container shortages, ongoing staff shortages, backlogs in stock levels, it's no wonder shipping costs are going through the roof.
But in these extreme situations that we've had now with the pandemic and a lack of supply chain resources, we've had delays in receiving those containers and to be able to return them. So the shipping lines aren't showing much leniency in this situation, and they impose container detention fees. Now, sometimes that might be a few $100s, but depending on the circumstances, it can be up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And again, that on top of the freight rates, surcharges and the like, it's all adding to the inflationary pressures.
Paul Zalai says across the entire supply chain, these unnecessary detention fees are costing Australian industry around $500 million a year. But that's just the half of it.
On top of that, we've got terminal access charges administered by our stevedores at our ports and those empty container parks, which again, a conservative estimate, that's about another $500 million. So at least an extra $1 billion a year being imposed on importers and our exporters on top of other costs.
And all of that flows down the line, back to you, the consumer, and your hip pocket.
I think you're just going to see the costs flow down the supply chain to importers through to retailers, and you'll probably see ongoing increasing costs on the shelves.